Welcome to the Joy of Automating. I'm Franklin Weber. In this episode, we are going to focus on refactoring templates, or a template in a community cookbook. And this is going to walk through really how we can make a template cleaner and clearer, moving that logic that usually we kind of just shove or jam in there to make it a much more delightful experience in terms of adding more features or just even understanding that template. So, and a big benefit too of this is we're going to do it in a community cookbook. So we're going to walk through the process of actually doing this with an actual community cookbook, one that perhaps you know and love, which is Chef Client. So let's get started. All right, hello. Hopefully, technically, this is all working for us. I'm trying a few different things. As always, our streaming is a fun experience, like a learning opportunity here. And I'm going to learn, and we're all going to learn a little bit with Nathen Harvey, the VP of Community Development at Chef. So he's joining us right off the farm, it looks like.
Yeah, how's it going, Franklin?
It's going well. It's good to see you.
All right. Yeah, good to see you as well.
Yeah.
I'm here to joyfully automate. I hear that's a thing.
Yeah, joyfully automating is fun. So yeah, this is the sort of series where I'm inviting some guests. Technically, this is all sort of an interesting experience. So let's walk through the process. So if we wanted to get started, I think we kind of picked a community cookbook that everyone knows and loves. So I'm going to go to the supermarket first as kind of like the experience. So let me share my desktop. And the beauty of this is I think you can share your desktop at some moment if you really wanted to, Nathen.
That's awesome.
And then I think your little head gets to stay in that corner there so you can kind of talk
Right.
and
So
oversee everything.
While you're navigating, why don't I just talk a little bit about the supermarket? So if you haven't seen it before, the supermarket is the place where the chef community can go and sort of share artifacts around chef. In the supermarket, of course, primarily what gets shared are cookbooks. There are also things like tools and plugins that you can share information about with other community members. So you can grab these freely from the supermarket. You can use them within your own ecosystem. And a lot of times, what you'll find is that if you go to the supermarket, you may find a cookbook that will help you get started. You may also just find patterns of how to implement cookbooks and recipes. You may find some good tips and tricks as you read through some cookbooks. You know, Frank, I always say that the way to become a better author is to read more books. And I think that the same is true with code. The way to become a better coder is to read more code. And so the supermarket is actually a pretty good clearinghouse for where you can go and find good chef code.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's something that I think is something incredibly powerful in learning is practicing, like writing and reading, right? Like if you're going to become an author, you got to read and you got to write both of those things together. And you're not going to write a novel every time. You're going to sit down and write a few stories, a few paragraphs, then you're going to go back and read a little bit, then write some more and read a little bit. Yeah, the whole point of this sort of experience is to do some of that. So this is great. So I'm at the supermarket website. You were mentioning tools and different things like that we can kind of switch between. If I were here, tools, that's where I could kind of go if I wanted to find like knife plugins and other things like that.
Yep, or if you click in the upper nav there, the tools and plugins link,
tools and plugins,
that landing page will actually tell you what sorts of tools and plugins can you find there. And you'll see that in addition to knife plugins, you can also find OHI plugins. I think you wrote one of those recently on one of these episodes.
Yeah.
You can find various drivers, like drivers for Test Kitchen or provisioning drivers, and then also compliance profiles. So if you have or want to look for examples of how to write inspec for compliance, you can find some of those here as well.
Yeah, that's something that we haven't done too much in the show. Like I said, I'm pushing for once it becomes the default in the Chef DK, making a big sort of transition. We did spend some time in an episode kind of going over that, so look at that if you're interested. So I'm going to go look for the Chef Client Cookbook to kind of learn more about it. I like that I have a cookbook named after me, which is, I've got something, my test cookbook. I think I was trying to test out some dependencies. So here's the Chef Client Cookbook. This is one that, is definitely the first one that I remember when I started learning chef. I think you taught me in the, brought me over to the dark side, or I was the Padawan in this situation. You were showing me Chef Client as far as like its ability to set up to run on an interval, and then also delete your validation key. But there's another recipe inside of there, which is the config recipe, which manages your configuration file, and that's essential for installing OHI plugins. I think we were seeing and stuff like that, and besides OHI plugins, like any sort of like exception handlers, report handlers, any of that kind of information gets loaded from that. So here we are. Let's go grab the source code for this. So I'm going to come here and grab the source. Now, we kind of ahead of time looked at this cookbook just to kind of see like what's some work on it, but familiar with just kind of working with it over time. There's always like this cookbook's probably been around since the beginning of time almost, and could always use a little love.
I think it said 2010 was when it was first published. Back there on the
2010 back there, probably on this page here. Yeah. All right, so 2010 when this first published, right? Yeah. So this could probably use a little love. It's about 6 years old. There's other newer, fancier cookbooks that have drawn attention of other developers. And this is one of those things where we're going to get involved with it. So I'm going to start with forking the cookbook to sort of take a look at it. I guess I could clone it locally, this version, but I know that we're going to make some changes to it. So I'm going to clone it to fork it to my profile on GitHub. And then I'm going to go through setting this up locally.
Hang on. I'm a little confused already. What are you doing here? Why are you forking this cookbook?
Well, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to fork the cookbook because what I want to do is perhaps propose some changes to that cookbook. And while I am a chef, employee, I have the right to make changes to the Chef Client Cookbook repository. If I was a community member or someone that didn't have that right, this is how I'd actually have to start. I'd have to create my copy of the cookbook, make the changes to my version, make sure everything's working in my system and set up. And then when I feel it's good and it's ready in that way, then I can share it back with the community, the Chef Cookbook's community version of it. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So basically you and I have met before and kind of talked about a thing that we'd like to refactor here.
Yeah.
And so you'd like to not only just refactor it for yourself, but also contribute that back to the community. And so the way to start with that is by starting at the source code. You're going to fork that source code into your own repository, and eventually we'll put a pull request in to ask that your changes be merged into the primary, like the Chef Cookbook's Chef Client version.
Right, exactly. All right, so I'm going to clone this down. I'm going to copy this little SSH here. Let's run to the command prompt, and I'm going to git clone. I think this is a good enough spot as any. I just work in my home directory,
It's
hardcore like
good
that.
To be home.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of work in progress, so I can just work in my home directory like this. All right, so I'm going to work in the Chef Client Cookbook here, and let's open up in the editor. And that config recipe is the thing that's interested me and caught my attention before. So while working with the community cookbook, kind of viewing it, I definitely remember seeing the config recipe setting up things on there. So let's open up that config recipe. So here's the config. Yeah, this was the config recipe. So take a look at it a little bit. This is always interesting to look at here. I see that we have this right here. It's saying like I'm including some helper methods. So there's some sort of library inside of this cookbook that takes care of loading some helper methods. And then I see also that there is all this code here that says if the log file is a string and the init, okay, so this is something that maybe we could take a look at as well, but this is saying setting up sort of log rotation, right? I guess that's what it's doing, log rotation on the right platform, otherwise setting up log standard out. Okay. Creating some directories. This is interesting. I'd love to take a look at this as well. And then what else could we take a look at here? This is probably the part that I'm interested in, which is if we're going to focus on refactoring a template and looking at a template that has sort of grown out of control, in your organization, sort of in your cookbooks that you might be working with, this is probably a good example of one that needs just a little bit of pruning. And this one right here is the template resource that is going to write out to the chef client conf directory client.rb. And that is going to use this as the source, the client.rb.erb. And you notice here it does a lot of things in terms of like variables that are being sent to it, which is pretty crazy. So let's open this up. Let's take a look at this client.rb.erb. So if I open up the templates directory, I'm going to look under default. And under default, I'm going to find client.rb.erb. So here we are. This is the template. And as far as templates go, this one has a lot of, so important things to know about this template, I guess compared to other templates, I should say. This template is writing out a Ruby file. So this is ERB writing out Ruby, which is a little bending, like mind bending in some cases. So we're going to see a lot of Ruby inside of tags, right? So there's all these like ERB tags. And then we're going to see Ruby actually being written out here when it's not inside the tags, right? So there's going to be a lot of extra ends and a lot of extra things, right? Because really what we want is in the final configuration file, you know, certain codes like this inside of here. So that's why this is why we see a lot of Ruby inside of Ruby in terms of this file. Okay. How do you think? Like, what do you think of this file, Nathan? How do you feel when you see this?
Yeah, when I look at this, my eyes go a little cross-eyed. Frankly, Frank, like it's kind of crazy. I see angry squids everywhere. That to me is like an immediate sort of code smell. That maybe this is a thing that we could do in a different way that wouldn't require so much logic in the template. It feels like we're putting a lot of control flow into a thing that should basically be used for presentation, if you will, right? All we're doing is writing out a file. There must be some way that we can simplify this. I'm also looking at like line number 12 in particular.
Yeah, this one right here.
Yeah, like,
yeah,
wow, like that whole block, it feels like it looks like we're doing an each and then a crazy next if. Like, I think we can clean this up a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, as somebody who spent a lot of time working in, I guess, Ruby on Rails developer, you know, there's the whole thought about like skitty, you know, we talk about model view controller. And model view control, you know, I make fat models and you want to make skinny controllers. But oftentimes what happens is you end up with fat views as well. Right, and so someone might have gone with the same sort of methodology here, which is I don't want to make the config recipe. The recipe is sort of thinking about that's the controller. I don't want to make this uglier than it has to be. So they probably pushed a lot of the logic into here. And I think what we should do is definitely, I think we're going to make a big mess. So I think we're going to make a bit of a mess moving stuff into the recipe. But ultimately, I think we'll do, you know, some good work or clean up along the way. But let's start with this. Like, wait, like this is confusing. The end right before this right here. Like, I think this end is actually tied to this line number 1 up here. So it does read like this. If I kind of do the squint test or sort of just think about the blockage of things, really this end looks like it's associated with this block right here. And really there's no reason for it to be. Like, this would be a simple change that actually would just make it, you know, like a little bit more readable, right? That's a simple change that ultimately would, I think, produce some value. And maybe our first pull request, right? I think that might be a simple sort of pull request to get us started.
I wonder if there are other places in this template where we have such simple changes.
Yeah, that's a good one. And this is a Ruby file, so whitespace is not important. So that didn't make a bunch of sense to me that would be there. Yeah, let's kind of like play a game. So if we look at here, this each do, so you can play the count of do and ends. We see this do right here. I don't see an end until, well, I see an end here, but this end is tied to this else, which is tied to this if. And then this else.
When I look at this, Frank, I mean, clearly line 30 is the end, right?
Yeah, I think, yes. Wait. So this end is tied to this else, which is tied to this if. So these are all tied together. So line 30 is not, yeah, that is, I almost thought that too. Yeah, clearly if they sort of broke the code up that way, then they probably do. But I think this is a group of code right here. So I think maybe this is the end. And again, I think when's, so this if else end. So these are kind of taken up with each other. And then we have this end right here, which is tied to this else, which I think is tied to this when. So I think this is the end. I think that's it. Do you think does that feel right? I kind of crossed out the ones in the middle there. Maybe I'll undo that. But my sort of logic is if, else, end, case, when, but whens can have, or cases can have else's, and then they need to always have an end. So these are tied together. So it looks like by process of elimination, these two are there. Yeah. And it shouldn't be that hard. I think, you're right. I think your initial assumption here, thinking that this being the end, is what you clearly would think. So I think adding another space here would just actually be a really valuable move. And we could probably go through the same thing right here, right? We could sort of put a little spaces between this, unless end, unless end, unless end, if end, unless end. And then this one again is one where, this is a block, unless end, right? And then unless end, and then this rescue doesn't need to be next to it, I don't believe. Oh, actually this does. I bet there's a begin that, so this is all inside of this sort of begin. But, we could just kind of put that right there. Maybe that's not as clear. I'm not sure how you feel about that one.
Yeah, it almost feels like lines, to me, like lines 57 through 73, it feels like they should be, just shimmied over a little bit. I think that would make rescue and end a little bit more clear. Yeah, to me, that looks a little bit better.
Yeah. And that'll actually write out the code correctly, right? Because this ERB is going to write out the start handler at this position right here inside of the code. So that's going to work. I think that's the correct intention for it as well. So, yeah. And I think we're near the end of the file. Yeah, this is it. This is the end of the file. They did the same thing. They did the right thing here that you're kind of talking about. They indented the code here to kind of show that you're inside of this Ruby block that they're sort of defining here. Let me turn off wrapping for a second, just so you kind of get to see that a little clearer. Yeah, I think that's a good first pull request that we could open up.
Hey, also while we're here, Frank, I don't mean to be pedantic, but let me be pedantic. When you shimmied those in, what did you use there? Was that a tab?
Oh, my editor, I did use the tab key, so that's a good thing. So I did use the tab key, but that turned it into spaces, I believe. So I've got that set up default for my editor as someone that spent some time in Ruby, that all my tabs are 2 spaces. So I know the Ruby, I know how the Ruby community is, and I believe Chef being part of the Ruby community, I think what we want to do is adhere to that standard. So
I think 2 spaces is the right way to go. I applaud you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well. I like to walk the line there, So when I'm writing my JavaScript code, I camel case things. I use perhaps tabs or 4 spaces, whatever the rules are in the community. I try to use those. All right.
Yeah, it's important to follow those conventions because, we're going to turn this into a pull request, and if your pull request doesn't follow the conventions that the community has agreed to, it's less likely that your pull request will be accepted.
Yeah, and that's where the hard part is. From a community member, it's hard to make small, those little changes. It feels bad too. You feel bad, right? Someone sends you all that nice work. They're really proud of it. And then all of a sudden you're I don't want to say you're shitting on it, but you're kind of crapping on, you're kind of saying, would you fix the spacing? Looks good, but fix the spacing. Kind of feels like that.
That's not a great experience either.
Yeah. My wife joked with me this morning as I was talking to my daughter. I said my daughter came up to me and she said I got my boots on, Daddy. And I'm like, you did, but they're on the wrong feet. I should have just said, I wish I just had that moment where I'm but I'm worried about your feet. I'm worried about the, damage to it. But I probably should have just said, great work, type of thing. So in this case, yeah, it's good to use the spaces so we can just kind of hopefully get the foot on the shoes on the right feet type of thing.
Yeah.
Right, so let's go through the process of saving this change. So I am going to want to do a lot of work with the community cookbook. So this is my cookbook, right? My copy of the cookbook. But the whole point of this cookbook is that I want to make my changes, provide those fixes, and then share those fixes with the community cookbook. So I think I really should set my GitHub repository up to be aware of that community cookbooks repository, number one, and maybe perhaps even make it the default that I communicate with, right? So right now, for those that know Git, like I'm going to be talking to my origin, and usually I'm going to be basing everything off of my origin. There's a few commands that we can run to get that set up that's going to say, hey, my GitHub repository is really based off of that remote repository. And so let's walk through setting up some of those commands before we go through setting up, like, say, this first sort of commit or pull request. So I'm going to set up the remote location. So I'm going to do a git remote add, and I'm going to call it upstream. That's generally the feeling that most people do, or they call it. If I look back, or if I think about, would I go to the supermarket? Did I leave that page open? Yeah, well, here's the Chef Client Cookbook. So this is the remote one that I'd like to set up. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to say git remote add upstream. And if I do git remote -v, that's going to show me my two locations that I can send stuff to, my origin and my upstream. Now,
So your origin is your fork of the code, and the upstream is the place from which you forked it.
Yeah, exactly. And we want to keep those naming conventions. And that's what we want. We want to keep those naming conventions because it's clear, my origin means for me. Sometimes people use upstream. They might use the name of the organization, like chef-cookbooks. Upstream is just sort of the generic term for it, which I like. And so now let's do git config. So we're going to change the config because every dot, I'll just use Vim because it's kind of quicker on this one. There's a configuration file for every Git repository. If we look at our master branch is pointing to origin, and it says, hey, pull everything from origin there. But really what I want is to track, the upstream version. I want to track the remote one because, the upstream one, because I want that work to be the one I sort of base everything off of. So,
that way, if the upstream changes and you have additional work that you want to commit back, and you can easily pull down the upstream changes. Is that right?
Yeah, because otherwise, if I wanted to, I'd have to do, I can just say git pull, and git pull will automatically choose my, whatever my default value that happens to be set in my configuration file, which would be my origin, which is like, I don't really need to be pulling from my origin all the time. I really need to be pulling from the community origin all the time. And that's the thing that I think is useful. So I could actually manually edit that file, like that file I just opened up. I could actually change this to upstream right here. But there's a git command that lets you do that, which we're going to say git config, and we're going to say branch master, and we're going to say remote. And I'm going to change it to upstream. And you remember, if we look at that file here, it's slightly different. It's going to say branch master, and it's going to say upstream instead of origin. So now I'm going to be, every time I say git pull, master branch is going to automatically synchronize me with all the community changes, which I think is right. I think that's the right setup in terms of what we want. Because my local changes, if I was in my own company and we were all submitting changes to it, that might make a difference, right? That might be the choice that we want to make. But in this case, I think we want, the place where a lot of the work is being done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. You're going to, we might submit a pull request today, but you might come back to this in 3 months and have another change that you want to submit. Well, in the ensuing time, or in the meantime, the upstream, the Chef Cookbook's version of this cookbook has changed. And before you make another change, you definitely want to pull down those changes so that you're updating the most current version of that cookbook.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. I think I'm making it a little bigger, Nathan. I think you deserve to be a little bit bigger. You get promoted for that statement there. All right. A little bigger window. All right, so let's go with here. So now let's start a branch. So I'm going to check out a branch. And here's the other little trick, and I think we were talking about this, is that when I create this branch, I want to track a different location. So I'm going to call my branch name. Let's just do white space. So I'm going to use my name, Bertlow, white space. I think that's really what it is. Or maybe formatting. Let's just say template formatting. We'll call it config template formatting. And I want to also track that. So instead of running that git config command like we did for here that changed the master branch to see the remote, we can also do this kind of -- track, which is going to say, hey, also watch that one to begin with. So we'll change that branch. So, did you intend to?
I think you need to do a git pull first, Franklin, because it's not. I don't think it's seeing the upstream master since you changed the remote. on master. Let's try that.
Yeah, let's try that. There we go. So I've got some upstream locations. There we go. So let's try this again. Okay. And if, again, I think we can kind of just peek at that .git config file, and we can look at that branch Bertlow config template formatting, and it automatically set the upstream master versus which the default is going to be origin. So that's nice. All right, so we've got this one. So let's do a git status. So now we can actually do a little bit of work here. We see the modified file. I can do a git diff. That's going to allow me to see the differences. And really, we did just some simple formatting. I think we added some lines here. So those little changes right here are just those pluses, which are empty lines. And those are good commits still, right? This added to the readability. It's going to save somebody a few WTFs that they can use later on in the day. And then formatting, that looks
good not to use this all in one template.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, so let's add this. And let's do a commit. And so updates the template for readability. I feel like that maybe kind of tells it. So we added some spaces. The reason I tend to write a lot of good commit messages also, well, I have a trick later, but I try to think of what my pull request is going to sound like, right? So I start to sort of pre-compose my pull requests in these messages, and I think that's useful because community people, they're going to look at this, anyone's going to look at your code and they're going to want to know why you did it. So we added some spaces to make it clear when blocks start and end. And then we indented, and I of course misspell a ton of things when I do this, indented for clarity to show when code was inside begin rescue block is what we called it. Okay.
Yeah, and I really like this in terms of a git commit message. When you think about your commit messages, the best commit messages are those that answer the question of why was this change made. You can very easily look at your git logs and figure out exactly what changed, but it can be more difficult sometimes to suss out the why. What was the reasoning behind that change? And so this is a pretty clear message. It's telling me that you've updated it for readability. You're also giving me some additional information here. And one thing that I might recommend, Franklin, before you close this out,
yeah,
because we're working with GitHub, these commit messages will be rendered in GitHub flavored Markdown. So you might actually want to have those added and indented, those two lines. Maybe those are bullet points.
Yeah. And that's what GitHub flavored Markdown or Markdown. I'll just do little stars for that. Yeah. The one thing you don't do with the GitHub flavored Markdown is putting I'm going to do this to show H1, H2. That's a comment still. So, all right. So that's it. All right. So I'm going to write and quit to save this. We can now look at the commit we just made. So I've got a little shortcut. I'll just show this visualization of this. Excuse me, Nathan, I'll move you just for a second. There you go. And what you see now is there's our commit. It's on this branch. It's ahead of both upstream master and origin master. And we just committed it 2 minutes ago. I probably should do a commit with you, though, right? Maybe. I don't know if we can include you in that. I've never done a group commit. I think you can sign it with 2 people. I can't remember. Well, maybe you just let me take this one for now.
Yeah, it's all you, buddy.
Okay, thanks. I did the typing anyways. That's the hard work. All right. So, all right. Let's now push this up. So I'm going to do a git push origin. That's going to tell me, hey, you probably should set up a real location. When you say git push origin, that's kind of the gist of this. Is that it chose a behavior on which it did. And so when you said git push origin, it's like, hey, I did create the branch name for you, but really I probably should have said, or I could have gotten rid of that warning message if I pushed up git push origin config-template-formatting like that. I have a shortcut actually called gpox, which says whatever branch I'm on, push to origin with that one. So it's kind of a nice sort of saves me the time of writing this out because branch names are actually important. We don't usually talk about them, but it's important a lot of times to kind of use your name sometimes with them. You should look at, of course, the project and how it works. Okay. I'm going to open up this. I have a shortcut that kind of takes me to the page. So I'll take you to the page here. We're now on the GitHub page, and here is mine. And I have that nice green button which tells me I can open up a pull request. And I think when you click on that, it automatically, yeah, if we look at this, it automatically chose, and this is a difficult thing, I think the first time I ever saw this, which was, wait, what's going on here? Like, where am I opening up this pull request? Who's going to be seeing this? Is this for my repo? Is it for the original repo? And I see that actually this is right here. So this is, of course, Chef Cookbook. So that's the organization. That's the cookbook. So here's our org that we're talking to. Here's our cookbook we're talking to. And then there's our branch we're saying we want to merge onto. And I think that's right. We want to merge this to master, or we're going to let them choose whether they want to merge it to master, but at least compare them. This is our account or our org. So it's either like our own personal org account. There's our cookbook, and then of course there's our branch name. And then the nice part, as you said, was this was going to be flavored as GitHub flavor markdown already. So they already kind of populate that information here. I think nowadays there's a guidelines for contributing, which we probably should have read. And this is where I go, oh, wait, I'm going to write this. Let's just go back here and do git log and just copy this content right here. And it saves me a ton of time to just go there. Updates this. And I think I'll just bring this back in a little bit. So that's the description. The title is already up above, so I probably don't need this. This is just the description. Added space to make it clear. We are not resolving any issues. Oh, do all the tests pass? Well, we only changed white space, but this raises the good concern. We should probably run the tests. All right, so let's do that. So chef exec rspec. I think this is going to be a little noisy, but because I am running an older version of Chef, and there's some warnings that are going to pop up, but I think this should work for us. And it's going to take and really we just care about the config file, so let's just focus on that one. So spec, unit, and then the config recipe. Let's just run those ones and not all of them. Okay, so that's going to run in the background. I'm pretty confident that we didn't hurt anything with white space. I would normally let this finish up. So we'll leave this right now. So this is actually GitHub, and this is going to, if we view this, preview this, this is actually going to create a checklist. So we can actually open up the pull request and then wait, and then if all the tests pass, we can check that box. Or if we don't have the right to check that box, someone else is going to check that box for us. So we don't have any new functionality that includes testing. New functionality doesn't need to be documented in the README. The CLA needs to be signed. Oh. So that's something that I don't think I've done, or maybe I have done, but I don't know if I've really signed up my account through Chef. So that's something we should think about. So let me create the pull request. And I think, like I said, we can't make I can check the checkboxes. Okay. And let's go through the process of associating my account with my GitHub account with Chef, so I can actually submit this work, right? So Nathan, the first process I remember, because I've done this before, I've already set this up. I have an account that I set up already in the supermarket. That's kind of step number one. When you go through that, when you set that up, I don't remember, do you have to sign the CCLA there, or does that happen after the fact?
No, so first let's just describe what is a CLA or a CCLA first, right? So the CLA is the contributor license agreement. So most of the cookbooks that Chef manages today that are open source cookbooks are all fall under an Apache 2 license. And so at Chef today, we ask you to sign a contributor license agreement. This is an agreement that essentially says that we all, both you and the people managing the project, agree that this software is licensed under the Apache 2 license, which means basically that your commit is your commit and it's our commit. Our code is our code and it's your code. It's all freely available for the community to use. Now, you shouldn't take those words that I said as the full meaning and description of the Apache 2 license. You should definitely read it yourself. But this is what we ask for when you're going to make a contribution. We are looking at changing that process in the future, so that you don't have to sign a CLA. Instead, what we will move to is what we call, or what is called in the industry, Developer Certificate of Origin. And that says with every commit, you basically say, I have the permission to contribute this back under the terms of the license of this project. So when you do submit a PR into a cookbook or any of the open source projects that Chef manages, we actually have a little bot that's going to go in and check to make sure today that you have signed the contributor license agreement. And the way that it will check that is you actually sign the contributor license agreement here on the supermarket. And then if your supermarket account is associated to your GitHub account, then that bot can make those connections, and it can look at your pull request and say, oh yes, Franklin has signed the contributor license agreement, so we don't need to worry about the legality of accepting this pull request. We can just view this pull request on the merits of the code that's been contributed.
Oh, great. All right. Well, I see. Wait, thinking about that, I think there was an update here on this one, which is probably the bot that came through.
Oh yeah. So look at that. It's a thing called Curry that runs in the background. So as it tells you here, I'm an automated pull request bot named Curry. There are commits whose authors are not yet authorized to contribute to Chef software. So let's get you authorized to contribute, Franklin, shall we?
Yeah. Oh, and look, we already got a comment. Look at the Chef community flying into action.
We sure did. Look at that.
All right. Well, we'll come back and read that one and sort of process that when it comes.
Well, let's come back to that. Let's get you signed up so that, or set up so that it knows that you're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to manage my profile here. Make you tiny, Nathan, for a moment. So on my profile, I have a profile. I've got my name. My personal information is perhaps going to be displayed. I don't want to go too far down here. All right, and then I think GitHub account is where we're going to go. All right,
yeah, it looks like you haven't connected your GitHub account yet to your supermarket account.
Okay, let's do that. So I'm going to connect my GitHub account. This project is supermarket by chef would like permission to access your account. You only want my public data. That's all right. My public identifying information. I assume that's probably my GitHub username, and just that's probably about it, type of thing. I have to check what public data actually happens to be, but I think that's probably all you need. So I now have a GitHub account. It looks like we're connected. It says this Bertlow account is connected, and it looks like we're ready to go. So I think we're connected now. I don't know if the Curry bot comes through and says, hey, I'm going to go check this out now, but it looks like, oh, what's this? Travis is going through and doing some work as well. Okay. All right, now let's come back to this comment. So we signed the CLA, or at least I've definitely signed the CLA. So here's my agreement. I think I've got my signatures already signed. I think I signed it a while back. I think I re-signed it together. Yeah, we did it last night again to sort of like make sure, or I did it last night to make sure it was all done and ready for us. As evil does a read, the thing we actually removed spacing so the end result wouldn't be a mess of extra spaces. ERB was kind of evil like that. Ideally, we just move the logic out of the template and pass it as a big hash to the template. All right, okay.
Oh, that's an interesting comment. So here it looks like the template itself has been optimized for the legibility of the output, as opposed to optimized for the legibility of the template itself, the ERB template.
Okay. Well, this is actually where we're going to go around this. So I wouldn't take this as like a slap on the hand in terms of like we did the wrong thing. I mean, we learned a little bit in the process, like you're saying, that this was for the legibility of the output, not for the reader. But what I believe TAS 50 is telling us.
That's Tim, by the way.
Yeah. He's saying to us he's saying in this moment, what we probably want to do is clean up that template, right? So let's move the logic out of the template. So we could move to our next sort of pull request, or at least our next work to kind of explore kind of cleaning up that template. So let's walk through that. So we'll say, well, we got a conversation going. We got some community love, interaction, but let's go back to do a little bit more work. So I'm going to return back to master because it sounds like we are going to want to start from that one. So this pull request, this small change is not something that we're interested. We could probably talk a little bit more about the white space with Tim, and but I think let's just go for another one here. Let's set up another template. So checkout -b. So there was all that command, right? That tracking that we wanted to do. So I'm going to make sure we have this. But I guess before we do it, let's think about the work we want to do. So before we do a template or before we name the branch, let's do another refactor. So now we're back on this one with the spacing sort of back to where it was before. So let's scroll back to the top. I feel like, as I like to say, I feel like this is pretty good right here. I might make a small change unless this is empty. This is one thing. So this chef requires, let's figure out what this is actually. So I'm going to split this over to the right, and I'm going to open up the config recipe over here, and I'm going to look for the chef requires. So chef requires is here. Chef requires is a variable that kind of comes in. And the chef requires is an array, so it gets initially defined here. And then I think we load a bunch of different things that are getting pushed into this. So there's a number of gems that are being loaded, I think, from this value right here. So this is something that seems to be all right. So this seems okay. We could say something like, if it's not empty, but unless it's empty seems about right. And that seems okay. This could be indented a little bit, or maybe that's why that sort of white spacing is why why Tim was saying don't do this, that kind of thing. So I'll leave this as is. Let's move to this one, which is right here. Let's move to, so let me open up that client.rb ERB on the big screen now. So let's look at this next little block here. So this is the thing you were talking about. Both and I were kind of looking at it and going, oh, like what's happening here? So it says chefconfig keys sort. So we have this content, all of this content inside of here. And this says, I'm going to space it just for us so we can kind of see it, and we'll bring it back. This is saying for every one of the chefconfig keys, so this is being passed in, chefconfig, which is from the node attribute, chefclientconfig. Every one of these, we're saying sort them, and then just kind of alphabetically sort them for purposes of, I guess, we're writing out. And then it says next if, so in a loop, you can skip the loop if you use the next keyword. And we say next if this right here, if this array of names includes the option being specified. Okay.
Okay, so you've already lost me, Franklin.
Yeah.
Let me just try to kind of parrot back what I'm looking at here, and you can tell me if I'm correct or not. So
let me wrap it a little bit to give you kind of all the view there. Yeah.
So chefconfig is just a node attribute, right?
That's it. Yeah, it's just a node attribute.
Okay, and so it must be storing a hash, which is a Ruby's way of storing keys and values.
Yeah.
And so we're going to sort that hash based on its keys, and then each one do option. What's that? What's the option thing? I'm not clear what option is going to look like on the first pass through, let's say.
Yeah, on the first pass through, because what is option? Yeah, because so, yeah, well, this would be good if we had a test and we can kind of peek at this. Maybe we can take a look at it. I mean, that brings up a situation. Maybe we could use pry to see what's going on here. So I'm going to take back that spacing for purposes. Let's actually just see if we can put a pry statement here. So I'm going to say require pry. And hopefully you have a test, and I think we do for this because we ran those tests in the background. I didn't check them yet. Require pry, and let's do a binding.pry. And we'll see if we can breakpoint right here. And if we can breakpoint right here successfully, then we can kind of see what option looks like to kind of give you an idea and see if that works. So I'm going to see here. Oh yeah, here are the tests. They ran 21 examples, 0 failures, so things were good. We had a pretty decent amount of coverage. So instead of checking out any things like that, I'm just going to run this test. And honestly, I probably should run a particular test that's going to check this file. But I'm just going to go for the shotgun approach and hope that one of these is going to run and one of these is going to pause, and we'll kind of get an idea of it. And then we can exit out when we're done with it. So
great.
All right. We'll pause for a moment, contemplate our life. Are we doing the right choices? Are we making the right choices in our life? I don't know. And see if we get some, this is what I love about local testing, unit testing, and then of course pry, when this is going to hopefully give us the breakpoint we want in that area. There we go. So we are currently inside of the template. And this right here is chef mixin template context. So this is kind of like what class or essentially what object we're in. So inside that template, it didn't give us actually a view of where we're at. Usually you can type where am I, and it will tell you that. But I think we're in some sort of, we know where we're at, but we can't quite see it here. So let's do ls. ls is going to show us all the available things that we can do at this moment in time. And I think we can see all the methods that are available to us. And then probably most importantly, we can see the local variables. And there's your local variable you're talking about, which is option right there. So we can type in option, and then I think we can get an idea of what option happens to be. So chef server URL. Okay. So option happens to be that value right there. So we can exit.
So that option might be one of the keys. So it must be the first key so we sorted on the chef config keys. So that's the keys are the keys in the key value hash pair. We sorted those, and then we're pulling each one off. So option in this case happens to be the chef server URL, which was, I guess, in the chef config node attribute, must have been the first one alphabetically sorted, the first key.
That's right. And then we could actually look at that value by doing what they're doing later in the code, which is pull this. And this test is just using localhost 56717. So eventually that's what that's kind of written out to the file. But that's what it is. Yeah, that's one of the keys. So we could look at the test itself also. We could have done that. So let me open that up. But that kind of gives us a good idea. It's always great to just kind of realize, bridge that mental model to the actual physical model here. So here's the config spec. Let's look for...
I'll tell you the thing that set me off, Franklin. When I see a bunch of periods all strung together there, that's the thing that has me say, wait, I have to make sure, like on that, if you go back to the ERB
the actual code,
right? There were all those periods, like the keys, .sort, .each. I just want to make sure that I understand exactly what's happening there. Like, what's the chef config? What did we start with, and what are we ending up with as we traverse through those method calls?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's for sure. Yeah, that's a good one to have to sort of figure that out right there. All right, so let's look at this, the test here. So let's see what's going on in the test. So in the test, I think we had localhost, right? So maybe that's just sort of a default value that gets set. I guess not. So I thought we'd see localhost inside of the config spec here, but I don't see it. Here's a test that sets up with custom attributes. Maybe that's just a value that's automatically set. Well, we can go to another one and kind of see what's going along here. So let's just do exit, and that's going to give us another one just to kind of see if you're right. So there's client fork, and then we could run true. So let's look back at the test. Client fork, is that something that's automatically set? Client fork, right? And we can eventually just see the actual test itself, but client fork, that's not here in the test. I don't see it in the file, but we're getting the idea. So it's all the keys that are inside of there. Okay. And then let's do just one more, just log location. Sure, okay. So now we're done. We kind of get it. We could keep pausing here, but I think, let's exit out. And that's going to break the execution, so that's good. All right, so what we're getting an idea from this code here in the client.rb is that this right here, and I'll remove this breakpoint. So it's every one of the keys in the node attribute, and every one of these essentially things, if any one of them matches this right here, then we just want to skip it. And I think the reason why we want to skip this, if I remember correctly when we're kind of zooming down, exception handlers, report handlers, start handlers, HTTP proxy, HTTPS proxy, you see down here, this is actually pulling from chef client config HTTP proxy, HTTPS proxy, no proxy. I believe start handlers and end handlers are all taken, and exception handlers are all taken care of. So all of these ones are actually taken care of elsewhere automatically. Oh, and here's even node name, right? So if the node name happens to be there. So all these are taken care of automatically for us. So these ones have special considerations, like they're already they have their own way of being written out. So I think this is the moment where we're doing something that, I don't know what to call it. It's sort of like, we're kind of like throwing all the colors and the whites in the laundry machine, and having everything in the laundry machine like this. It's like we're trying to have it all sort of like sorted out inside of there. And laundry machines, at least, this code can do it. But laundry machines, really, we should try to treat this like a laundry machine. We should probably do some pre-sorting and then just send this content to it. So if any of these have special exceptions, we should probably just get rid of them out of this list of items. And not sort of sort it here. So my thought is, let's take this code right here, the thought of extracting this information or removing this from the loop, and instead, why don't we just do this, which is let's remove the special or the items, the config items with special considerations or are taken care of later, and create a new array with the items that do not have it, right? Have special considerations. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. So this was kind of the logic we had for that. So which ones had special considerations? This is it, considerations. And naming will come up with a better thing. So these are all the items with special considerations. And this is the array of all the items. So here, what we want to do is another method that we can use with the Ruby array, which is reject. And reject will say, I'm going to look at the entire contents of the array. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the contents of the array, I'm going to remove any items that this sort of block holds true for. So we can do something like this. We can say, I reject for every item I look at in the array, if the item, essentially if special considerations includes that item, right? So we can say include the item that we have here. Right, I think that would show that. And so let's make sure reject is the right word here. Let me just show you where I kind of got that from. I mean, I'm pulling it out of my head in terms of documentation, but if we go quickly to rubydocs .info, and here, if I go to the core documentation, so pause for a moment, core documentation as it loads, and I can look at either array object, or I can look at the actual just reject method if I'm interested in. And there's reject. And we can reject items down here. So you notice here's an example, array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Reject any items that are less than 3. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 qualify. And I think that qualifies. So we're rejecting any where this sort of statement is true. So essentially, if this statement is true, is this item in the special considerations, then reject it. And let's just, cleaned up our, it's kind of weird. I don't know if I want to call this not specially considered or just sort of generic maybe. Let's just call it generic config. We'll call it generic chef config. Okay, for now.
So these are the whites and the special considerations are the colors in your laundry scenario, maybe?
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing. Or the delicates or the...
Yeah, the delicates, right.
The sweaters or whatever. Everything that I shrink when I do the laundry. All right. So here, I'll put the generic chef config. And then if I go back to the template here, I think I could just delete this line. Because now we've essentially done some pre-sorting before we threw it into the system here. This is not, the best in terms of like where we want to finally leave the code, but let's execute our tests. So let's run our test suite and run that in the background and kind of talk about or pontificate on this little code back here about where we can kind of take that and some of the naming conventions.
I'm a little bit worried about it, frankly, because so like we just assigned generic chef config to the chef config variable. Can we look at the template? Was it using that chef config, like at chef config, anywhere else?
You bring up a good point. Yeah, at chef config. So let's take a look. So it's definitely using it here within the loop, but that's when it was rejecting these items. You're right. And then it's using the chef config here. Okay. So really what we want is to maybe change this one. Yeah, you bring up a good point. So this is going to break here, and hopefully our tests catch it. So at least this one is going to break if node name happens to be one of those items that was the one that was needed special consideration, and it did. Hopefully our tests are going to fail. If they don't fail, then we have a problem. If they do fail, then of course we have the problem that we created for ourselves. So yeah, you bring up a good point there. So in some cases we might do generic chef config, define this as the chef config, and then we could still just use chef config, which was this right here. Right, I probably just switch the order of these to kind of keep that the way we had it. And that's not great naming wise, but I think that's pretty good. So now we could actually just use we can use generic chef config inside of here to define this right there. And then really it's okay if we kind of pull information from the chef config, but we probably want to pull it from the sort of sorted array of items there. Yeah, again, this is one of those. The other option is we could have gone through and changed this to, really we're just kind of pulling the node name from the chef config. We could also pass the node name separately. This is maybe something we could also refactor, which is should you write out this text or should you write out this text? And that's something we could also sort of define inside of the recipe itself, right? And we could figure that out ahead of time.
Right.
You're either writing out a comment or you're writing out the actual line for the node name. But let's go with this example for right now, at least this work. Okay, so this is ugly right here. Think of our tests. Oh, they're going to take a little while. We're getting close to running out of time here, but this is a good start to kind of a refactoring and kind of understanding this template. I get the impression that we're probably not going to see a failure, even though we probably should. Hopefully we should. But let's talk about where we might want to put this code. So this code right here is really not the right spot for it, especially inside of the template resource. So we could move this out of the template resource and we could move this into here, right? Like we could move it outside of there. So at least it's doing the work outside of the template resource, so it's not as complicated inside of there. However, this is not really the great place for it either. I mean, it's nice and clear here, but this is one of those situations where a helper method might be an appropriate way of sort of looking at that content. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's something we could move into, our libraries directory into our helpers file.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might be nice in that it will remove that sort of complexity. First, we removed it from the template. We kind of ate that complexity here in the recipe. It might, like, you could argue, I think, either way. It might make sense to move it into a helper recipe because it will remove, again, that complexity from the recipe. But then you kind of have the concern of, but does it abstract it too much so that you don't really understand what's happening without having to drill through too many files? So I think it's a debate that we could have, and I think we should try it and see. Like, that's part of the beauty of open source, is we can try doing that, submit a pull request, and see how the rest of the community feels about that. Did we make it clearer, or did we make it more obtuse?
Right, exactly. And I think that's something that I always like with all code. That's why, number one, I love pair programming, because of course I can make these considerations, I can make these decisions on my own, and then without any thought, my ego gets involved. Of course, this is the right way of doing it. And then, any kind of peer review is a great way to say, like, hey, did I make the right choice? As always, because it's good to have other people kind of coming in there and helping you sort of. This, code is not about your own sort of personal, story to sort of deploy these systems. We're all doing this together, so we need to think about how everyone reads this code and understands this code. So, yeah, and that's something I think is always a pull request is going to be a good conversation starter for that. So let's quickly just kind of move this into just a helper method. This is something like we could say here. I'm going to open up another panel down below. And I'm going to open up, this is helpers file here. So you remember up above in this file, we had this moment where it says chef recipes, ops code, chef client helpers. This is, for those that aren't familiar with, the whole colon really for Ruby is really just saying, like, almost like a slash. So much think of this like directories. And it's saying, just go back to the root of all sort of modules, objects, everything. Kind of go back to the root of everything and then sort of build a directory structure on down. Because the thing is, like file right here, are we using chef's file or Ruby's file? We don't know, so oftentimes we can put a colon in front of it to kind of clarify that sort of statement. So that's all they're doing here. They're saying make sure we just kind of reset our scope. And so we're saying load ops code chef client helpers, and we see ops code chef client helpers. And include means put these methods inside of the recipe sort of domain, and we currently are in a recipe file, so this makes a lot of sense. So any methods that we defined here, like create directories, right? Create directories was one that I mentioned before, we can now use here. So this is the kind of thing where we could easily say, well, what if, config, special considerations is kind of not the great name, because we could say like config, config with special config with special considerations. This is where a pull request might even be good to kind of help us name these things. We could say, let's grab this, let's call it this, and then, you know what, I'd like to just maybe make this a method as a start. And I don't know if it's, again, the right thing to do. Oh boy, it's hard to find the end of this thing. So instead of making a mistake, I'm going to do this. I probably would have put it at the end of the file. So def config with special configurations. I'm just going to have that be a method that returns, my config with special considerations with it as a start. I think that might be just kind of nice to sort of just say, well, that cleans up this. Of course, someone's going to be perhaps confused when they look at this source code and they say, what is this config with special considerations? And then they see generic chef config. Again, we could also do, we could also extract this one into, a helper method as well, right? So this is like the classic kind of Ruby thing, generic chef config, right? So this is just, and really generic chef config seems, it's like really generic chef config doesn't really tell us exactly what we want. But I think what we want is like chef config values written generically, is kind of what we want, is the long-term or long name version of it, that we can kind of maybe come up with a better name ultimately, but I'll go with that for right now. So we can kind of extract that into just this right here. So this just now uses this, right, which uses that. We've got our loop. And that might be a good start as far as like cleaning that up. Is that what this cookbook maintainer in the community wants? I don't know. But it's one of those things we could submit a pull request and then figure it out and see if that is. This is one of those moments where we definitely would want to run our tests afterwards, to kind of see that, to make sure everything's working. And I think, like we said, we had our test pass. I mean, even if we make the changes here, I think we might need to write a test case for that other situation which you described so intelligently there, Pat, about the node name.
Right.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot here that we could do. This template is something that really can consume a lot of time. As we see that, like here, we can start to move the logic in. And this is something I've done before. Particularly, I've done this with, like I said, Ruby programming. Things get uglier before they get better type of situation. You've got to move this logic back out of the template into the recipe. And then, as you pointed out aptly, what do you do? Do you choose to leave it inside of the recipe, or do you decide to move it into helper methods? And that's something that I think as a team you need to figure out. It's definitely something that, we're not active maintainers on this project. We're just kind of visiting and, squatting in this situation. So I'm not sure if we can make the right decision at this moment, but it's one of those where a good conversation will kind of come up about it.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we've learned here also, just through that one simple pull request we made, is you have considerations about the consumers of the thing that you're changing, right? So when Tim Smith commented on our pull request, it became clear that we were optimizing for the reader of the outputted or the generated client.rb, not optimizing for the developer of the cookbook. And so sometimes it makes sense to optimize for your consumer. Sometimes it makes sense to optimize for legibility within the code. And so I think that these are things that we need to consider also. Like moving these things into helper methods certainly doesn't change or shouldn't change the output that we see. So maybe this is a good compromise where we're not only optimizing or making the developer experience better and the maintainer's experience better, but also not impacting the consumer of this cookbook who just wants the chefclient.rb to be written properly.
Right, exactly. So the remaining things that kind of work in this cookbook or any of your templates, if you're looking at any of your templates or this one, if we looked at this remaining code here, this is something that we could take a look at, which is here we see, again, we have a special case when the log level SSL verify mode or audit mode is there. You'll notice that we write out option, and then we write out, which is the name, right, the key that we're actually writing out. And then we're taking that config, we're looking up the value, and then we're replacing what from this regular expression is telling me the symbol, in case they put a symbol notation, a colon in front of it, we're stripping that off, and then we're turning it into a symbol. So, this is exactly, if you want to look at this, it's like imagine you had a string which was called, log level, and you said to symbol on it, it's going to turn a the quote symbol. It's going to create the symbol out of a symbol type of thing. Whereas what we're hoping for is, stripping that symbol off of it. This is, again, what IRB is great. We can look at like something like this and go, what is going on with this crazy code, right? And we could say, oops, I put too many dots there. We can strip that off. Like, how does that, that's stripping that off of there, and then it's turning it into a symbol. And then we could look at that last little bit of code, which is inspect. So it actually literally writes out :log_level. Just make sure it's written correctly on the output. But this is again.
Sorry, if you've done that without the colon, but do you still have that IRB open?
Oh yeah, yeah.
All right. So yeah,
Yep.
So you get the same result either way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of beautiful, and that kind of leads to flexibility for the consumer of the cookbook.
Yeah, and that's something that's really nice. So in this case, we might want to have that, flexibility. And so what we're seeing is this is not so much a special case, but this is like a flexibility of these keys are ones you're allowed to specify with as symbols. They're usually treated as symbols or written to the files as symbols, and we want to make sure that they get written correctly as symbols, even if you specify symbols in the attributes, because you might be familiar with that. Log location is another one here, which is a special exception. Because ultimately, we should say, really what we want is something like this, right? We really want just, ultimately, I think we want to see this, which is for every key, sort it, do it, right? We just want to see that code. That's the ultimate sort of template code here. So all these special exceptions are the things that we kind of want to consider and then see if we can do the pre-processing before we get into it. Thinking of the laundry example, we just want to pull out all the items, pre-treat any stains, do any kind of stuff to make it all sort of generically a place we can just dump the code. The log level, or this log location one is one that we need to look at. This one says if it's a string, then literally write this value out. Otherwise, write the value out, which is something interesting to take a look at. Why is that case? So in this case, if it happens to be a string, actually write this thing out. Otherwise, whatever the value happens to be, write that out. And then, of course, here's the generic option. So these special cases are things that we each sort of take the step, move it all back into the recipe, consider whether we want to leave it inside the recipe or move it into a helper method to kind of support that and clean that up. Yeah. All right. Well, Nathen, thank you very much for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun looking at this community cookbook. Thanks, of course, walking me through community cookbooks, the whole process, making sure my GitHub account was all located and set up correctly so I can do that. And then seeing a little bit more, of course, of that process of like the community interaction, the sort of GitHub pull request workflow and a lot of those things. I think that's great. It's going to make it easier for perhaps those that are following along kind of get involved with the community. So.
Yeah, I certainly learned a lot. It was a lot of fun just to walk through this, and it is kind of amazing how much refactoring we could continue to do on this. I feel like we have at least another hour that we could spend in this one cookbook, and it would probably make it better for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'll probably make a few of those changes and submit them up before I leave, but I encourage other people to do that within this cookbook, other community cookbooks, or your own cookbooks is a good place to start with all that. All right. Well, thank you very much. I've got a head-on-head type of thing. I've got too many pictures of me doing this. I should do my desktop here. Whoop. Picture-on-picture there. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Joyfully automate. Go out there. Do your things. Bye.
Thanks, Franklin.
Yeah, thank you.